South China Morning Post, 27th of September 2022, China's debt leniency claim for developing nation restructurings undercut by transparency issues. Economists said that China's claim that it outranks the world's other major economies by the amount of debt it has deferred collecting from developing countries is hard to prove due to a lack of complex data. The Chinese government desires China to become a superpower. Instead of war, they focus on financial dominance and supremacy by using money as their primary weapon. China's loans have supported infrastructure projects across Africa and Southeast Asia for a decade, including via its Belt and Road Initiative. However, recent loan issues in Laos and Sri Lanka have added suspicion about Chinese debt. Restructurings, including canceling debt and changing repayment terms, have already taken place, said James McCormack, Managing Director and Global Head of Sovereign and Supranational Ratings, at Fitch Ratings. The biggest criticism leveled at China by the international financial community is that the debt restructurings are not sufficiently transparent, making it more difficult for other creditors to assess what level of support they may need to provide to ensure the debtor country's external debt position is sustainable, he said. China has been doing its utmost to support developing countries as they seek to address their difficulties in line with the principle of joint actions and fair burden sharing, Wang said last week in Beijing. China lends money to developing nations' economies to expand their infrastructure, which generates wealth for Chinese businesses, provides jobs for Chinese citizens, and increases trade flows of Chinese goods, all of which ultimately increase China's government's geopolitical influence and power. In July, China made progress in its agreement to restructure Zambia's debt while also negotiating with 30 other African countries, said Alicia Garcia Herrero, a chief Asia-Pacific economist with the French investment bank Natixis. A list of cases tracked by the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies China-Africa Research Initiative showed Chinese creditors Exim Bank and the China International Development Cooperation Agency had suspended more than $1.3 billion in debt service in 23 countries under the G20 program, including 16 African nations. Chinese officials often forgive zero-interest loans to less developed countries and have also arranged debt equity swaps, said Sun Yun, director of the Stimson Center's China program in Washington. This involves taking over the strategic infrastructure of the defaulting country. Zero-interest loans are relatively easy to write off as direct foreign aid but make up just a fraction of China's total, and its policy banks expect to be repaid, said Scott Morris, a senior fellow with the Center for Global Development, an independent Washington-based think tank. But it is hard to know how much debt China has forgiven because it does not disclose the terms of its initial agreements with developing countries, said Han Nanjie, an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong. Garcia said that China had not joined the Paris Club, a decades-old group of officials from 22 countries who help nations pay off loans, because membership would require more transparency. Protests erupted in Sri Lanka in 2017 over a decision to hand over operations at Hambantota International Port when Colombo could not repay loans China had made to aid its development. Some experts said that deepening financial problems in countries that owe China money could attract attention from other creditor nations and multilateral lenders, such as development banks. If other countries are offering loans to African states, China might try to sweeten its deals, Han added. China and the United States have long been vying for influence in Africa, with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying in August that countries should have choices and weigh them transparently. Since the 1980s, Japan, the U.S. and China have also sought influence in Southeast Asia, a politically neutral hotbed for investment and newly wealthy consumers. In Asia, China could impact impoverished Laos if it restructured its loans, said Thitinan Pongzudarak, a political science professor at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Around half of the Laos debt is owed to China on loans for projects, including the China-Laos Railway. The Southeast Asian country's international reserves are almost empty as Laos faces huge debt, Pongzudarak said, with its total public and publicly guaranteed debt amounting to 88% of its gross domestic product. If Laos goes into sovereign bankruptcy, it really makes China look bad on a number of fronts, Pongzudarak said. It leaves room for other countries to come in, and would set a bad example that China doesn't support Laos. He added that a deeper debt crisis in Laos would further undermine Belt and Road credibility in other countries, referring to China's Belt and Road Development Plan. To head off future debt problems worldwide, Morris added that China might lower lending rates, extend repayment terms, and securitize loans with collateral such as minerals or revenue from infrastructure projects. Morris said that China took an equity stake in the Lao Railway because it figured Laos could not repay an equivalent value loan.